Together with his best friend, Christopher Rivers, Joe opened an auto repair shop along with a specialty automotive parts store in Tallyville. Before long, people throughout the area knew them as successful business partners who had built everything from the ground up. The two friends were incredibly close, shared the same vision, and poured everything they had into growing their business. Joseph had always considered himself a committed bachelor until he met a Russian woman named Olga. The two first connected through an online dating website. Conversation came easily from the start. Both were mature adults with plenty of life experience, and they quickly discovered they had a lot in common. Olga explained that she was in the middle of a divorce and had only recently moved to the United States. Joe opened up about his own past relationships and the future he hoped to build. Both were outgoing, confident people who shared similar interests and looked at life in much the same way. It wasn't long before those conversations turned into something much deeper. Then one day, Joe realized he couldn't imagine his life without her. He proposed. Olga said yes, around 2 a.m. on September 23, 2013. A series of gunshots shattered the quiet outside the Paladin Club condominiums in Wilmington, Delaware. When nearby residents rushed outside, they found a man and a woman lying on the ground. Moments later, a call came into emergency services. The caller reported that a targeted attack had taken place and that 2 people had been seriously injured. Paramedics arrived within minutes and immediately began providing emergency medical care. Despite suffering gunshot wounds to the face and losing a significant amount of blood, the woman was still alive. The same could not be said for the man beside her. His body showed multiple gunshot wounds, and he had no signs of life. Investigators believed he had passed away almost instantly after being struck in the back of the head. Time was running out. Realizing they might only have a brief opportunity, officers tried to ask the woman what had happened. She managed to mumble a few barely understandable words before losing consciousness. She was rushed to the hospital, but despite every effort by medical staff, she passed away before they arrived. As investigators processed the scene, they recovered identification and personal belongings. The victims were newlyweds, Joseph and Olga Connell. What immediately stood out was what had not happened. Their wallet, purse, cell phones, and even Olga's diamond ring were all still there. Nothing of value had been taken. That told detectives this was not a robbery that had gone wrong. It appeared to be a carefully planned, targeted crime. Investigators later determined that the couple had been attacked just outside their home after returning from celebrating Olga's 39th birthday. The attackers struck without warning, firing roughly 25 rounds into the couple's backs. Now detectives faced a difficult question. Who would want Joseph and Olga dead? And could the answer lie in a family conflict that had been building for far too long? Joseph was born into a successful and close-knit family. He was the middle sibling, with an older brother named John and a younger sister named Kelly. Growing up, the three argued over ordinary childhood things, just like most brothers and sisters. But after their parents divorced, everything changed. The siblings became much closer and stayed by each other's side. After the divorce, they remained with their mother. Sometime later, she met another man and remarried. By all accounts, it was a happy marriage. The family remained financially comfortable, and Joseph's stepfather became the father figure the siblings needed. They lived in a quiet, comfortable neighborhood. During the day, everyone went about their own routines, and every evening the family gathered around the dinner table to talk about what had happened during the day. Joe grew up determined and hard-working. Those traits showed most clearly in school and later in business. Outside of work, though, he was outgoing, funny, and the kind of person who naturally became the center of any group. From an early age, he dreamed of owning a business and making something of himself as an entrepreneur. That determination eventually paid off. The only thing that gave Joe even a moment's pause was that Olga still hadn't met his family. But he wasn't worried about it. He had no doubts about the woman he had chosen, or about how his relatives would react. As it turned out, he was right. Olga's beauty and warm personality won them over almost immediately. His family could hardly believe that someone had finally managed to capture the heart of the man they all thought would stay single forever. Their relationship moved fast. Joe wanted Olga by his side everywhere he went. He was proud of her, admired both her appearance and her confidence, and never tried to hide how deeply he loved her. But as time went on, it became clear there was much more to Olga than her calm and gentle first impression. She had grown up in Siberia, and behind that soft exterior was an incredibly determined and energetic woman. Her drive and ambition impressed everyone around her. It seemed there wasn't a challenge she wouldn't take on. Joe was so deeply in love and so convinced he had found the right person that he saw no reason to postpone the wedding. Looking back, it's almost as if he was racing against time without even realizing it. You've probably known people like that yourself, people who seem determined to fit an entire lifetime into just a few years. After the targeted attack, police interviewed everyone who had gathered outside, including neighbors and people who happened to be nearby. Investigators hoped someone had witnessed something that could explain what happened. Unfortunately, no one had actually seen the attack unfold. Most people said they had rushed outside only after hearing the gunfire. A few witnesses did remember something important, though. Several reported hearing loud male voices just before the shooting began. It sounded as if someone was arguing with the newlyweds. Moments later, the gunfire erupted. Not far from the scene, crime scene investigators recovered a large number of spent shell casings. Ballistics showed they had come from 2 different firearms. That immediately suggested there had been more than one attacker. The sheer number of shots told detectives something else as well. Whoever carried out the attack hadn't come to intimidate the couple or send a message. They had arrived with a single, deliberate objective. Investigators believed the offenders had waited for Joseph and Olga to return home from the birthday celebration. The party had taken place at one of the area's popular bars. Friends and several members of the Connell family had joined the celebration. Everyone spent the evening talking, laughing, dancing, and celebrating until around midnight before heading home. When Joseph and Olga pulled into their parking space, they got out of the car and started walking toward the entrance of their condominium. That was the moment the attackers had apparently been waiting for. The next step in the investigation was speaking with the victims' relatives. Detectives began by interviewing Joseph's parents. Detectives asked Joseph's parents whether the newlyweds had any known enemies or anyone who might have held a grudge against them. His mother and stepfather couldn't think of a single person. From everything they knew, Joseph and Olga weren't involved in any serious conflicts. Then again, they admitted that almost anyone can become the target of jealousy or resentment. If someone had been holding a grudge, the couple had never mentioned it to their family. But during those conversations, investigators learned something unexpected. Just before the wedding, Joe had a serious falling out with his younger sister, Kelly. At the center of the argument was a valuable family heirloom, a diamond ring that had been passed down through the family for generations. Experts later estimated its value at around $20,000. The disagreement left a lasting mark on their relationship. Things between brother and sister were never quite the same afterward. Even so, every member of the family insisted on one thing. Kelly would never have been capable of arranging a crime against her own brother. There was another detail that made detectives hesitate before drawing any conclusions. After the attack, Olga was still wearing her diamond ring. It had never been taken. Even so, investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that lingering resentment had played a role, so they decided to look more closely at Kelly. There was another coincidence that immediately caught their attention. On the night of the attack, Kelly was among the first people to arrive at the scene. Although she lived in a different part of town, she happened to be nearby that evening. Joseph and Olga had originally planned to get married in the U.S. Virgin Islands. For a while, the wedding preparations went smoothly. The only real source of tension involved the engagement ring. According to a long-standing family tradition, Joseph's mother was supposed to pass the family's heirloom diamond ring to her son when he got married. The problem was that the ring had already been given to Kelly when she married 10 years earlier. Wanting to preserve the tradition without asking for the ring back, Joe came up with a plan that was as unusual as it was difficult to explain. Without telling anyone, he secretly took Kelly's ring, replaced its diamonds with cubic zirconia, and quietly returned it to her. He then had the original diamonds reset into Olga's engagement ring. Considering Joe's financial situation, his decision puzzled almost everyone who later learned about it. He could easily have purchased another diamond ring. Perhaps, in his own mind, this was the only way to honor the family's tradition without upsetting anyone. His plan depended on one thing. Neither woman could ever discover what he had done. But that wasn't how things unfolded. Kelly eventually realized the stones in her ring had been switched and immediately started trying to figure out who was responsible. When she discovered that it had been her own brother, she was furious. She confronted Joseph, while Joe believed his sister was overreacting. From his perspective, she was putting a family tradition, and even his wedding, at risk over something he thought had been done with good intentions. Despite the conflict, the wedding went ahead as planned. Kelly didn't attend the ceremony, saying she was too busy. But she didn't let the matter end there. Instead, she sent Olga a sharp, sarcastic message that revealed exactly what had happened with the diamonds. That was the moment Olga, who had known nothing about the situation, learned the truth. From then on, the relationship between Joseph and Kelly became increasingly strained. Their conversations often turned into arguments, with both sides trading accusations and old resentments. Then something else happened, something that left the entire family completely shaken. The newlyweds began their life together in the same place where they had exchanged their vows, the U.S. Virgin Islands. Their honeymoon was everything they had hoped for. Olga and Joseph spent their days relaxing on the beach, swimming in the ocean, fishing, sailing on a yacht, and trying local Caribbean cuisine. Money wasn't a concern. Joe was proud that his business was thriving and bringing in nearly $1 million a year. When they returned home, they celebrated this new chapter by buying a luxury Mercedes-Benz convertible. The car cost them around $100,000. Olga wasn't the kind of woman who wanted to rely entirely on her husband. She was well-educated, widely read, spoke English confidently, and had a natural ability to connect with people. On top of that, she had previous experience working in financial markets. Before long, she became actively involved in Joe's business, taking over many of the administrative responsibilities. Her impact was almost immediate. As soon as the charismatic blonde joined the company, the number of customers coming to Joe and Chris's shop increased dramatically. Then, just 1 week before the attack, something unusual happened. While Joseph and Olga were away, someone broke into their condominium. The intruder stole jewelry and several family heirlooms. Fortunately, Olga happened to be wearing the diamond ring that day, so it wasn't among the items taken. When the Connells returned home, Joe immediately realized someone had been inside the house and contacted the police. Investigators carefully processed the scene, but surprisingly, they found almost no usable evidence. The search for the person responsible led nowhere. Detectives considered two possibilities. Either the burglary had been staged, or it had been carried out by someone with significant experience. Because of that, Kelly once again found herself under scrutiny. Many believed she had a reason to stage the break-in. Some wondered whether she had never truly forgiven her brother for what happened with the family ring, and had decided to teach him a lesson. Even so, the investigation quickly reached a dead end. Then everything changed. The targeted attack on Joseph and Olga became the department's highest priority, and the earlier burglary was pushed into the background as detectives focused on solving the double crime. When investigators interviewed Kelly, she appeared completely devastated. She cooperated with detectives from the very beginning and answered every question openly. She admitted that she and Joe had argued over the family ring and even handed over their text messages. In one of those conversations, Olga suggested that Kelly herself might have been behind the recent burglary. Kelly firmly denied having anything to do with it. Even so, investigators couldn't remove her from the list of possible suspects. As Kelly later recalled, there were moments when she felt intense pressure from investigators. But despite what seemed like a clear motive, the evidence continued pointing in another direction. Throughout every interview, Kelly's account remained consistent. She never changed her story or contradicted herself. At Joseph and Olga's funeral, she appeared completely heartbroken. It was obvious that she loved her brother and was genuinely grieving his loss. At the same time, detectives continued exploring other possible motives behind the crime. Joseph had long been considered one of the area's most eligible bachelors, while Olga naturally attracted attention wherever she went. Because of that, investigators also looked into the possibility that jealousy had played a role. Perhaps someone from either of their past relationships had struggled to accept the couple's marriage and decided to settle old scores. But that theory also fell apart. The investigation found that Joe had ended his previous relationships on good terms, leaving detectives with no evidence that any former partner had reason to target the newlyweds. In fact, Joseph's former girlfriends had moved on long ago. They were married, building their own lives, and by all accounts were happily settled. The same was true for Olga's past. She had divorced her husband in Russia and completely cut off contact with him. Investigators considered whether he might still have held a grudge, but that theory quickly lost momentum. It seemed highly unlikely that someone would travel halfway around the world to carry out a carefully planned attack over a relationship that had already ended. With no evidence supporting that possibility, detectives ruled it out. Even so, the search for anyone who might have wanted to harm the newlyweds continued. At the same time, investigators couldn't stop thinking about the conflict between Joseph and Kelly. Financial disputes have often been at the center of major criminal investigations. So, after interviewing Kelly, detectives shifted their attention to her husband, Garrett Catalano. Garrett was deeply devoted to his wife and would go to great lengths for her. Investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that, if Kelly had asked him for help, he might have been willing to take part in a double crime. During questioning, however, Garrett remained calm, confident, and cooperative. He had a solid alibi for the night of the attack and also firmly supported his wife's account. But before the interview ended, Garrett made a comment that immediately caught investigators' attention. He said he wasn't convinced Joseph had built his wealth through legitimate business alone. Without making a direct accusation, Garrett suggested that Joe might have been involved in the illegal distribution of prohibited substances. At first, detectives treated it as nothing more than speculation. But as the investigation continued, similar claims began coming from other people. Several confidential witnesses told investigators they believed Joe had secretly been selling anabolic steroids and making enormous profits from it. Those same witnesses also mentioned another name, someone we already know. That information led detectives straight to Joseph's longtime best friend and business partner, Christopher Rivers. Chris reacted to the tragedy differently from almost everyone else around him. While Joseph's family and friends were visibly devastated, Chris appeared surprisingly composed and quickly returned to his normal routine. Of course, he suddenly found himself carrying the full weight of the business on his own. Meetings with suppliers, customer appointments, and day-to-day operations demanded his attention. Even so, investigators couldn't help noticing how unusually calm and energetic he seemed under the circumstances. Eventually, detectives brought him in for an interview. Chris explained that he had been invited to Olga's birthday celebration that night and had planned to attend. According to him, work kept him from making it. Then, despite describing Joseph as one of his closest friends and longtime business partner, Chris made an unexpected statement. He told investigators that Joe had changed in recent months and, in his opinion, had no longer been entirely honest in the way he conducted business. Rivers didn't stop with accusations against Joseph. He also cast suspicion on Olga. According to Chris, he had heard rumors that Olga wasn't who she appeared to be. He claimed she had come to the United States to represent the interests of a Russian organized crime group, and that marrying Joe had simply given her greater freedom to operate. If that were true, he argued, it could explain how the couple had accumulated so much money. But investigators knew those claims couldn't be accepted at face value. At that stage, they were nothing more than allegations that required careful verification. They could have been nothing but rumors, or they might have pointed toward something more significant. As detectives dug deeper into Joseph's background, they uncovered a detail that was a matter of public record. Several years before meeting Olga, Joe had been convicted on an illegal firearm possession charge. He served a substantial prison sentence. During his time behind bars, he inevitably met people with criminal backgrounds. Investigators considered whether, after his release, some of those connections might have drawn him into the illegal distribution of prohibited substances. If that had happened, perhaps Joe had eventually crossed the wrong people. Could relationships formed in prison have ultimately led to the attack? The investigation was beginning to take another turn. While detectives continued exploring the theory of an underground business operation, another unexpected witness came forward. Harry Cook, a man well known to investigators for his involvement in the illegal drug trade, claimed he had repeatedly heard Christopher Rivers speaking negatively about Joe. According to Harry, Chris believed his business partner had been stealing from him. Harry also told investigators that Chris had admitted they were using their auto parts store to secretly distribute prohibited performance-enhancing substances. According to Chris's own account, Joe was keeping an unfair share of the profits, while Chris, who was buried in debt, desperately needed the money. Meanwhile, Joe was allegedly spending freely on an expensive lifestyle. Harry claimed that Chris had once joked he wouldn't mind if Joe simply disappeared. Then, according to Harry, the conversation became much more serious. Chris allegedly asked whether Harry would be willing to help make that happen. Harry said he immediately refused. That statement cast Christopher Rivers in a completely different light. As a result, detectives interviewed him multiple times. Despite the growing suspicion, Chris had a strong alibi. At the time of the attack, he was at home, and both exterior and interior surveillance cameras supported his account. Even so, investigators decided to verify the financial complaints he had raised. Forensic accountants began examining the company's financial records in detail. The financial review revealed something unexpected. Despite bringing in impressive revenue, the business was actually losing money. But investigators soon discovered those financial losses had nothing to do with Joseph. The person responsible appeared to be the very man pointing the finger at him. Police informants told detectives that Chris had been using hard prohibited substances for quite some time, and that his addiction had recently spiraled out of control. That explained his growing debts and the money that had been disappearing from the business. According to investigators, the addiction had also fueled increasing paranoia. Chris had reportedly told several people more than once that he believed someone was trying to have him killed. Detectives uncovered another important detail. It wasn't Joseph who had allegedly been distributing anabolic steroids. According to confidential sources, Chris had been handling that operation himself. Joe, meanwhile, trusted his longtime friend completely and had no idea what was happening right under his nose. By then, Joseph's attention had shifted toward his new marriage, leaving him even less involved in the day-to-day details that Chris was managing. Much of this information came from a confidential informant whose identity was never publicly disclosed. Detectives found the witness after analyzing Christopher Rivers' phone records. One detail immediately stood out. During the night of September 23rd, Chris made an unusually large number of phone calls. Although surveillance footage confirmed he was at home when the attack occurred, his phone remained active throughout the night. Later, every one of those calls had been deleted from the device. Recovering them, however, wasn't difficult for forensic specialists. Most of the calls led to Joshua, a former confidential informant for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. When detectives interviewed Joshua, he admitted that he had done business with Chris on multiple occasions. Then he revealed something investigators had never expected to hear. According to Joshua, Chris had once offered him $65,000 to eliminate his business partner. The money was certainly tempting, but Joshua said he didn't want to be directly involved. Instead, he looked for other people willing to carry out the attack. To do that, he contacted Dominic Benson and Aaron Thompson. According to investigators, the two men agreed to carry out the job for $5,000, which Joshua received from Chris as an advance payment. Piece by piece, the investigation finally began to make sense. According to prosecutors, Joseph's closest friend had arranged the attack that claimed the lives of both Joseph and Olga. At first, detectives believed the motive might have been personal resentment or a desire to take full control of the business. But that wasn't the real reason. The investigation pointed to something far more specific. $1 million. Long before Olga entered Joseph's life, the two business partners had purchased life insurance policies to protect their company. If one of them passed away, the surviving partner would receive enough money to pay off the mortgage on their auto repair shop. Had Joseph died before getting married, Chris would have received enough to clear not only the business debt, but also the financial problems that had been piling up in his own life. Everything changed after Joe married Olga. From that point on, the insurance benefits would go to his legal spouse instead of his business partner. According to investigators, that was why Chris allegedly decided that both Joseph and Olga had to be eliminated. A conversation that took place between the alleged organizer and one of his associates on the night of the attack appeared to support that theory. Although their messages were encrypted, investigators believed it was clear that Chris was anxiously monitoring whether the plan had succeeded. To better understand those communications, detectives seized the cell phones belonging to all four suspects. The devices ultimately allowed investigators to reconstruct their movements throughout the night of the crime. At that very moment, Dominic Benson and Aaron Thompson were waiting outside the Connells' home. Ironically, the very surveillance footage that appeared to support Chris's alibi ended up working against him. The cameras showed him pacing around nervously, constantly checking his phone and barely letting it out of his hands. Once detectives tracked down Joshua, he chose not to fight the case. Instead, he surrendered to authorities. Hoping for a lighter sentence, Joshua agreed to cooperate with prosecutors and gave a detailed statement about the person who had orchestrated the entire plan. According to his testimony, Christopher had come up with a carefully calculated scheme. He intended to use the conflict between Joseph and Kelly to frame her for the crime. As the investigation progressed, detectives established that the burglary at the Connells' home had been another step in that plan. Following Christopher's instructions, Joshua broke into the house. But the burglary wasn't really about stealing valuables. The primary target was the disputed family heirloom, the diamond ring. By pure coincidence, Olga happened to be wearing it that day. Had the ring been taken, investigators likely would have focused their attention on Kelly, believing the family dispute had escalated into something far more serious. When that part of the plan failed, Christopher allegedly tried another tactic. After the crime, he attempted to damage Joseph's reputation by spreading stories about his supposed involvement in illegal activities. As investigators eventually concluded, the deaths of Joseph and Olga were the result of a carefully planned, financially motivated crime. In 2014, Christopher Rivers was formally indicted on multiple charges. They included 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, first-degree conspiracy, and first-degree solicitation to commit a crime. His alleged accomplices also stood trial. Although the cases were heard separately, they moved forward at roughly the same time. During Aaron Thompson's trial, prosecutors established that he was the person who fired the weapon. The jury found him guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony, and first-degree conspiracy. He was sentenced to 2 life terms, plus an additional 45 years in prison. His associate, Dominic Benson, was acquitted of the homicide charges because prosecutors established that he backed out before the shooting began. However, for his role in the first-degree conspiracy and for assisting those involved in the crime, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Joshua also received a 5-year sentence after cooperating extensively with investigators and pleading guilty to conspiracy related to the planned crime. As for Christopher Rivers, prosecutors identified him as the mastermind behind the entire operation. The jury found him guilty on every count. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, plus an additional 50 years in prison. There's a well-known saying, people can forgive almost anything except someone else's success. Despite his young age, Joseph had already accomplished what many people spend a lifetime chasing. He built a successful business from the ground up and found the woman he believed he would spend the rest of his life with. What he never got was the chance to enjoy either for very long. Together, Joseph and Olga could have continued growing their business, building a strong family, and creating the future they had planned. Instead, that future was taken away by greed and the resentment of someone they trusted. Financial gain has been one of the oldest motives behind serious crimes, and this case became another painful example of that reality. Christopher's addiction and relentless greed didn't just destroy his own future, they shattered the lives of everyone caught in their path. He will likely spend the rest of his life behind prison walls. Perhaps with enough time, he will overcome his dependence on prohibited substances. But whether he will ever come to terms with what he chose to do is a question only he can answer. Some people eventually learn to live with remorse. Others spend the rest of their lives trying to outrun it. And there are those who never hear the voice of their own conscience at all.